My husband looked me dead in the eyes one Tuesday morning and said, "Do you have any idea how much it costs to keep you?" I was 63 years old. I had been married to this man for 31 years. I was standing at the kitchen counter in my bathrobe, pouring myself a cup of coffee, and those words came out of his mouth like he'd been holding them in for a while and finally decided to just let them go. I didn't say anything. I took a sip of my coffee. I looked out the window at the backyard where I planted roses 20 years ago, roses that were still blooming every spring without anyone telling them to, and I thought quietly to myself, okay, Harold, let's see where this goes. I should back up. Harold and I got married when I was 32. He was 38, already established, already set in his ways in the manner that men who have been bachelors a little too long tend to get. He had his routines, his preferences, his opinions about the correct way to load a dishwasher. I found it charming at first. Most women do, until they don't. For most of our marriage, I worked. I was a registered nurse for 26 years. I worked nights, I worked weekends, I worked holidays, I held people's hands when they were dying. I came home at 7 in the morning, smelling like antiseptic and exhaustion, and I still made sure there was food in the refrigerator and clean towels in the bathroom. Our two kids, our son Barry and our daughter Faye, grew up knowing that Mom was always there, even when she was tired. Especially when she was tired. When I retired 4 years ago, something shifted in the house. Harold had retired 2 years before me, and in those 2 years alone he had apparently decided that the house and everything in it was now his domain, operating on his schedule, funded by his pension. His pension, which was larger than mine because he'd worked in corporate management and I'd worked in a hospital, and we all know how that math tends to go in this country. I noticed it slowly at first. He started commenting on grocery receipts. Not in a concerned about the budget way, more in a, "Why did you spend $40 on cheese?" kind of way. As if I needed to explain myself for buying good cheese. As if the 31 years I'd spent contributing to this household gave me no standing to purchase sharp cheddar without a committee review. Then it became the electric bill. Then it was the new throw pillows I bought for the living room. Then it was the dinner I had with my girlfriends every other Thursday, which he started calling "your little outings," in a tone that made the word "little" do a lot of unpleasant work. I told myself he was just adjusting to retirement, that he was feeling useless, and this was how it came out. I'd been a nurse long enough to recognize when someone's behavior is really about something else entirely. I was patient. I was understanding. I was, looking back on it, far too accommodating. Because here is the thing about being patient and understanding with a person who is being unreasonable. Sometimes they don't interpret it as grace. Sometimes they interpret it as permission. By last year, Harold had fully settled into a version of himself I genuinely did not recognize. He kept a mental ledger, it seemed, of every dollar that left our joint account that he hadn't personally authorized. He would bring up things I'd bought weeks ago, out of nowhere, in the middle of conversations about completely unrelated topics. I'd be telling him about something I read in the news, and he'd say, "Speaking of which, I noticed you spent $80 at that garden center last month. Speaking of which," as if there were a logical through line between international affairs and my hydrangeas, he started talking about money as if it were his alone. My pension, my account. Once, when I mentioned that we might want to look at repainting the guest bedroom, he said, "I'm not spending my money on that right now." His money. After 3 decades, after everything, I didn't fight him on it. I just listened, and I started paying closer attention. What I noticed over the following months was that Harold had a very selective definition of his money. His money paid the mortgage on a house we'd bought together, with a down payment I had contributed to equally. His money covered the utilities. the utilities for a home where I cooked every meal, did the laundry, maintained the garden, handled every appointment, every repair call, every holiday card. His money, in his mind, entitled him to make decisions. My contribution, because it wasn't arriving in the form of a direct deposit anymore, had apparently become invisible. I want to be fair to Harold. He is not a cruel man. He is not someone who set out to be unkind. But there is a particular kind of thoughtlessness that is almost worse than cruelty because it doesn't even have the dignity of intention. It just settles over a marriage like dust, and if you don't address it, eventually you're living in a house you can't see clearly anymore. I tried to address it. Twice. Once over dinner, once during a Sunday morning walk we used to take together around the neighborhood. Both times he listened with the expression of a man hearing a complaint that he considered technically interesting but personally inapplicable. He said, "I don't mean it that way." He said, "You're being sensitive." He said, "You know I appreciate everything you do." And then, the following week, he said, "Do you really need to buy new reading glasses?" What was wrong with the old ones? The old ones had a cracked frame that left a mark on the side of my nose. That's what was wrong with the old ones. So when he said to me that Tuesday morning, "Do you have any idea how much it costs to keep you?" I decided I was done explaining myself. I was done asking to be seen. I was going to let Harold have exactly what he seemed to want. I was going to be very, very literal about it. I smiled at him. I said, "You're right. I've been taking advantage of your generosity. Let's fix that." He looked mildly confused, the way he always did when I agreed with him, because deep down he knew when he was being unreasonable, even if he'd never say so out loud. He said, "I just think we should be more mindful." I said, "Absolutely. I'll be mindful." I went upstairs and I sat at the little desk in our bedroom where I handle household paperwork and I started doing math, real math, not emotional math, actual numbers. I looked up the average hourly rate for a housekeeper in our area. I looked up what a personal chef charges for meal planning and cooking. I looked up elder companion services because apparently that is the market rate for what I had been providing in terms of daily presence, conversation, and the general management of Harold's emotional and domestic life. I looked at what it would cost to hire someone to manage the household calendar, the medical appointments, the insurance paperwork, the communication with our kids, the coordination of every repair and service visit that had happened in this house over the past 4 years of our shared retirement. I also looked at my own pension deposit, which arrives in our joint account every month, and which Harold seemed to have forgotten about entirely in his narrative of sole provider. By the time I finished, I had several pages of very organized notes. I also had something I hadn't expected. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter and more clarifying than anger. A kind of stillness. The feeling of a woman who has finally seen something clearly after a long time of looking away. I put my notes in a folder. I put the folder in the drawer. I decided I would wait for the right moment. The right moment, it turned out, came looking for me. Harold's younger brother, his name is Douglas, he lives in Phoenix, was turning 70 in April. Harold decided, without consulting me in any meaningful way, that we would host a celebration dinner at our house. Not a small gathering. Douglas and his wife, their 3 adult children and various spouses, Harold's childhood friend from Ohio who'd been wanting to visit, a couple of Harold's former colleagues he'd been in touch with. 14 people, including us. Harold announced this about 3 weeks before the date, in the manner of someone reporting a fact rather than proposing an idea. He said, "I told Douglas we'd do a dinner for his birthday. Weekend of the 14th. I looked up from my book. I said, "How many people?" He told me. He said, "I figured you'd do a nice roast and maybe that potato thing you do and the green bean casserole. Douglas loves the green bean casserole." He said you'd do with the ease of a man for whom this required no discussion. I was the cooking and serving apparatus. He was the host. These were simply our assigned roles. I said, that sounds like a lot of work. He said, you've done bigger. Remember Faye's graduation party? I remembered Faye's graduation party. I also remembered that during Faye's graduation party, I had been recovering from a knee procedure and had still managed to produce a meal for 22 people, because Harold had told everyone it was happening before checking with me. Some patterns are older than I'd realized. I said, okay. I smiled. I'll take care of it. He went back to his television program. I went back to my book for approximately 4 minutes, and then I put the book down and began making arrangements. First, I called a woman named Teresa who runs a catering and event service out of a commercial kitchen on the east side of town. I had met her through my friend Agnes 2 years ago at a church fundraiser. Teresa does beautiful food. Her pot roast would make Douglas cry with happiness, and her roasted potato wedges with herbs are the kind of thing people talk about on the drive home. I booked her for the Saturday of the 14th. Full service, food, setup, 2 servers, cleanup. She gave me a very fair quote, and I gave her my personal debit card number, linked to my personal savings account, which Harold had never paid much attention to, because in his mind, my pension was just a contribution to the general household fund. Second, I called Faye and told her what was happening. Faye is 41, she lives 40 minutes away, and she has her father's number in a way that Barry, who is more easygoing, does not. Faye said, Mom, are you serious? I said, completely. She said, what do you need me to do? I said, just come. Be there. Watch. Third, I wrote a short letter. I printed 2 copies, put them in envelopes, and placed them in the drawer with my folder of notes. I want to be clear about what I was not doing. I was not trying to humiliate Harold in front of his family. That has never been who I am. What I was doing was much simpler and, I think, more honest. I was letting the reality of the situation become visible. I was removing myself from the invisible infrastructure of our life together, just for one evening, to show Harold and myself what that infrastructure actually looks like. The Saturday of the dinner, Teresa and her team arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Harold was in the garage when the catering van pulled up, and he came around the side of the house with his reading glasses on his head, and that look he gets when something unexpected is happening in his immediate vicinity. He said, "Who are these people?" I said, "That's the catering team. I hired them for Douglas's dinner." He stared at me. He said, "You hired caterers." I said, "Yes." He said, "That must have cost a fortune." I said, "Less than you might think. Teresa runs a very good operation." He said, "Why didn't you just cook?" "You always cook." I said, "I'm going to enjoy the party as a host this time. Spend time with Douglas and the family. Let someone else handle the kitchen." He stood there for a moment with an expression I can only describe as recalibrating. Then he said slowly, "I didn't authorize," I said. "I paid with my personal account. No need to worry about your money." I said it gently. I wasn't making a speech. I was just saying a true thing. I went inside to help Teresa get oriented with the kitchen. Harold stood in the driveway for another minute. I watched him through the kitchen window. He was thinking hard about something. I hoped it was the right thing. Douglas arrived at 5:30 with his wife and 2 of his kids. Harold's friend from Ohio, a big cheerful man named Pete who tells too many stories about golf, came a few minutes later. The colleagues arrived together. Faye came with her husband and my 2 grandchildren, which made everything feel immediately warmer and louder in the best possible way. Teresa's food was extraordinary. The pot roast was tender enough to cut with a look. The potatoes were crispy outside and creamy inside. There was a salad with candied walnuts and pears that Douglas's wife asked about twice. The birthday cake, white chocolate with raspberry filling, made Douglas actually emotional, which he covered by telling a joke because he is Harold's brother and that's how they handle feeling things. I sat at the table with my family. I talked to Pete about his grandchildren in Florida. I held my youngest grandchild on my knee during dessert. I laughed at Douglas's toast, which was long and wandering and sincere. I felt, for the first time in a long time, like a guest in my own home, and I mean that in the most relief-filled way possible. Harold was quiet through most of dinner. Not sullen, he was hospitable with his guests, attentive to Douglas, gracious in all the right moments. But I could see him watching Teresa's servers move efficiently through the kitchen, watching me sit at the table without getting up once to manage anything, watching the whole evening run smoothly on someone else's labor while I was simply present, simply myself. After the guests left and Teresa's team had cleaned up and gone, Harold and I were alone in the kitchen. It was clean in the way it only gets when professionals do it. I poured myself a small glass of wine. I offered Harold one. He took it. We stood there for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Then Harold said, "That was a lot of money." I went to the drawer and took out one of the envelopes. I handed it to him. I said, "I put some information together. I thought it might be useful." He opened it. Inside were two things. The first was a single page summarizing the market rate costs I had researched, not as a bill, not as an accusation, just as information. What it costs in this city in 2024 to replace what I had been providing to our household every single day for 4 years of retirement. The second was a printout of our joint account records for the past 12 months, with my pension deposits highlighted, which totaled more than Harold's framing of his money had ever accounted for. He read it slowly. He read it the way he used to read things that mattered, with his glasses actually on and his full attention given over to the page. He didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he said, "I didn't realize your pension was this much." I said, "I know." He said, "I've been..." He stopped. He started again. "I've been unfair. I didn't jump in. I let the words sit there in the clean kitchen the way they needed to." He said, "When did I get like this?" I said, "A few years ago. Gradually. I think retirement was harder on you than you let on, and this is where it went." He looked down at the papers in his hand. He said, "You should have said something sooner." I said something twice. You told me I was being sensitive. He didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one. I sat down at the kitchen table. After a moment, he sat down across from me. The second envelope was still in the drawer. I had prepared it as the version to give him if the evening had gone badly, if he'd made a scene or been unkind to Teresa's staff or tried to tell me in front of his brother that I'd wasted his money. That envelope said some harder things. I didn't give it to him. I said, "I'm not interested in keeping score, Harold. I never have been. But I also can't keep living as if my contribution to this marriage is something you can audit and overrule. It doesn't work that way. It has never worked that way." He nodded. A small nod, the kind that means I hear you and I'm ashamed. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want to not feel like a house guest who has to justify her expenses. I want decisions about our life together to be made together. And I want you to stop referring to our money as yours." He said, "That's fair." He said it like he meant it. We sat in the kitchen for another hour. We talked. Actually talked the way we used to before everything got stiff and careful and ungenerous between us. He told me that he had felt adrift since retiring, that work had given him his sense of purpose and worth, and he hadn't found anything to replace it. And somewhere along the way, that emptiness had turned into control because control at least felt like structure. It's not an excuse. He wasn't offering it as one. But it helped me understand. I told him about the second envelope in the drawer. I told him I hadn't given it to him because I was choosing not to, and that choice was mine to make. He looked at the drawer for a moment. He said, "Thank you." I said, "Don't make me regret it." He laughed a little. It was a real laugh, rusty from underuse. It sounded like the man I had married. That was 7 months ago. Things are not perfect. They were never going to be perfect at 63 and 69 with 31 years of compressed habits between us. But Harold signed up for a woodworking class at the community center, which has given him back some of the purposefulness he'd lost. He made a serving bowl last month that is honestly beautiful. He put it in the center of our kitchen table without saying anything, and I understood it for what it was. He has not once referred to our money as his. Last Thursday, I had dinner with my girlfriends, the one he used to call your little outing. When I came home, the kitchen was cleaned and there was a cup of tea on the counter, still warm. He'd made it for me. I stood there in my coat and looked at that cup of tea and thought about 31 years and all the ways a marriage can calcify without either person noticing, and all the ways it can. With enough honesty and enough courage and enough willingness to sit in a quiet kitchen and say the hard thing plainly, it can breathe again. I'm not telling you this story because I want credit for patience. I'm not telling it because Harold became a saint or because I handled everything perfectly. I made mistakes in this too. I waited too long to draw a line, and waiting is its own kind of message. I'm telling it because I spent 31 years being invisible in my own home, and it took a catering van and a one-page spreadsheet and a cup of tea on a Thursday night to remind both of us that invisible was never something I agreed to be. And I never will again. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the catering van in the driveway, not Harold's face when he saw Teresa's team unloading equipment, not even the envelope I handed him in the clean kitchen afterward. The moment I keep coming back to is smaller than all of that. It's me, standing at the counter in my bathrobe with a cup of coffee, hearing those words come out of his mouth, and choosing in the space of about 3 seconds not to argue, not to cry, not to explain myself again, to simply decide that the truth was going to have to make its own appearance, because I had run out of ways to describe it in words he was willing to hear. That choice, that quiet, deliberate choice to let reality speak instead of my voice, is the thing I'm most grateful for when I look back on that whole period. Because here is what I've learned about people who have stopped really seeing you. You cannot talk them into seeing you again. You can explain until your throat gives out. You can be reasonable, you can be patient, you can lay out your case with perfect logic and a warm tone, and they will nod and say, "I hear you." And the following Tuesday they will say something that tells you, plainly, that they heard nothing at all. What changes people is not explanation. It's consequence. Not punishment, consequence. The natural, honest result of the choices they've been making, finally becoming visible. Harold didn't change because I gave him a speech. He changed because one Saturday evening, with his brother and his old friends and his grandchildren all around the table, he saw what our life together actually looked like when I was present in it, as a full person instead of a function, and then he sat in a clean kitchen and read one page of numbers and understood, maybe for the first time, that he had been telling himself a story about this marriage that was not true. That's the thing about choosing to stay in your own integrity while someone else is being careless with yours. It asks something real of you. It asks you to be honest enough with yourself to know the difference between patience and erasure, and smart enough to know when one has become the other. I waited too long, I know that. I made my own mistakes in this, and one of them was mistaking silence for dignity, when sometimes silence is just the long way around to the same conversation you should have had years earlier. That took some honesty to admit, but admitting it is what kept me from carrying resentment into whatever came next. And what came next was not perfect. A woodworking class and a cup of tea do not undo 31 years of accumulated habit overnight. But they are real. They are chosen. And there is a kind of strength in choosing to stay in something and fight for its honesty rather than simply leaving the field. Not because leaving is wrong, sometimes leaving is the only right thing, but because in our case the foundation was still there under the dust, and we were both, finally, willing to look at it clearly. I am 63 years old, and I am still learning what it means to stand in my own life without apology. I imagine I will be learning that until the very end. But I'll tell you this, that one-page document I put in that envelope with all those numbers and all those highlighted deposits was not a weapon. It was just the truth, made legible. And the truth, when you finally let it into the room, takes up exactly as much space as it always deserved.